Is the Bible contradictory? Do some parts of Scripture contradict other parts of Scripture? Well, Paul says that all Scripture is given by inspiration of God. Since God is all-wise, that would imply that he would write a non-contradictory word. I agree with Paul. That's why I can't agree with John Piper. Because Piper says, if you look at the quote underlined on the page, quote, "The psalmist is quite against Malachi 3. I, the Lord, do not change, and therefore you are not consumed." And the psalmist says, "It is my grief that the Lord has changed." End quote. So Piper thinks that the psalmist is quite against the teaching of Malachi 3. Anyone that knows that Christ is the speaker in the Psalms, that he's describing his own experiences, will find Piper's comments almost comical. It's like saying that Christ is against Christ, or Christ is quite against Christ. Because Christ is speaking in Psalm 77, and he's also speaking in Malachi 3, because Christ is the Lord. So Piper thinks Christ is quite against Christ. Perhaps we should all take the hint that it's not the Bible contradicting itself, it's Piper contradicting himself. But at this point I'd like to contrast how Piper interprets the Psalms and how he uses the Psalms with the method used by the author to the Hebrews. On the one hand, Piper quotes the Psalms and says, "Look how forsaken the psalmist is. Look how God's removed his face from the psalmist. This is going to be our experiences." In other words, he's using the hell, wrath, and condemnation that the psalmist experienced and placing it on believers today and saying, well, you too are going to experience hell, wrath, indignation, condemnation, etc. from God. On the other hand, the author of the Hebrews quotes the Psalms and applies them to Christ and gives comfort to the Hebrews through the sufferings of Christ. He does not say, look at the psalmist, you should be like him. Instead, he says, this is Christ crucified, his atonement, he was forsaken, as the book of Hebrews says, God says, I will never leave nor forsake you. For example, look at Hebrews 5 verse 7. It says, Christ, in the days of his flesh, was offering both petitions and entreaties to him, being able to save him from death, with strong crying and tears, and being heard from his godly fear. Now look at the first 3 verses of Psalm 77. My voice, and by the way, note the words crying, voice, distress. My voice is to God, and I cry. My voice is to God, and he gave ear to me. In the days of my distress I sought the Lord. My hand was open in the night, and did not grow numb. My soul refused to be comforted. I remembered God, and am troubled. I meditate, and my spirit faints. And note also that in John 12:27, Christ says, and my soul is troubled, and what may I say? Father, save me out of this hour. So just like in Psalm 77, we see Christ crying for the Father's help with entreaties, petitions in the day of his distress. Likewise, Hebrews 10 verse 5, the author of the Hebrews says, for this reason, coming to the world, Christ says, sacrifice and offering you do not desire, but you prepared a body for me. So again, we see the author to the Hebrews using Christ's sacrifice and the fact that Christ came to make an atonement. He's using this to comfort the Hebrews. He's not saying to them, sacrifice and offering God not desire, but now you need to put up a sacrifice, you need to be forsaken, you need to make an atonement, God will hide his face from you. No, he's pointing to Christ's life, death, and resurrection as the ground for their comfort and hope. He's quoting the Psalms in this manner. He's not trying to make them emulate or experience the sufferings, the affliction, and the forsakenness described. Now, contrast the author to the Hebrews with Piper. Piper, instead of trying to use the Psalms to comfort believers, like the author to the Hebrews did, Piper attempts to put believers today under the hell that's experienced in the Psalms. The psalmist did experience affliction, forsakenness. He was literally abandoned by God. And Piper attempts to put us under that wrath and indignation. He says,
this psalmist, his name is Asaph, he's a musician, poet, saint, and he was really discouraged. He was really down. Let's read it in verses 7 to 10. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never be favorable again? Has his loving kindness ceased forever? Has his promise come to an end forever? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger withdrawn his compassion? Then I said, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. Now, I believe that's typical Christian life. I don't expect 2000 to be anything other than struggling with that. Verses 7 to 10 is pretty clear that this Asaph fellow is in the pit, doubting God's compassion, wondering about God's reliability, thinking God's loving kindness has ceased, wondering whether he's favorable at all, saying he's changed and has become fickle, quite against Malachi 3. I, the Lord, do not change, and therefore you are not consumed. And he says, it is my grief that the Lord has changed. This man's in trouble, where we are a lot of the time.
Can't Piper see Christ in Psalm 77? Christ could say, it is my grief that the Lord has changed, because he was forsaken on the cross. He was made a curse, and thus, because he was accursed, he could not fellowship with the Father. Not that God himself had changed, but just like with a fire, when you walk away from a fire, you cease to feel its heat. Not that the fire has changed, it's just your relationship to the fire has changed. Yet sadly, Piper can't see this. He applies Psalm 77 to the experiences of Asaph, implying he's smarter than the author to the Hebrews. But Piper should note well, he applies the Psalms to David, and thinks that believers today should experience the wrath and curse that the psalmist experienced. The author of the Hebrews, on the other hand, applied Psalms exclusively to Christ. And as Hebrews 3 verse 6 says, we are Christ's house if we hold fast our boldness and the glorying of our hope firm to the end. So the author of the Hebrews and his readers were assured of their salvation, infallibly assured. They had boldness and glorying unto the end. And it's very interesting that the King James and the New American Standard, in fact almost every translation, has for Psalm 77 verse 10, and I said, this is my infirmity, but I will remember the years of the right hand of the Most High. And if you're not familiar with the right hand of the Most High and the connection that has with Christ, I don't know if this is going to help. But in Hebrews 12 verse 2, it says, looking to the author and finisher of our faith, Jesus, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right of the throne of God. And the author to the Hebrews is quoting Psalm 110, quoting the Psalms and applying them exclusively to Christ. And this is particularly interesting when you consider who was the author of the Hebrews writing to? Well, obviously Jewish believers. And the Jews probably revered no one more than King David. So, in order to encourage these Jews, surely the author of the Hebrews would have appealed to something about David's life, David's personal experiences, something about his walk with God and how he was preserved in the faith. But no, the only reference we have is David is listed as one of the saints in Hebrews 11, and in Hebrews 4 verse 7, it says, God marks out a certain day, saying in David, today, etc. So the only reference to David is God quoting a psalm and merely using David as a mouthpiece. God said in David. David was merely a prophet, as the book of Acts says, and God spoke through his mouth. To say any more is to take the glory from Christ and to give it to David, something the author of the Hebrews never did. And to say the Psalms are David's experiences and not Christ's alone is to do what every unregenerate Jew has done since Pentecost. To privately interpret the Psalms, to call the apostles liars in their interpretation, they exclusively apply them to Christ, and to call Christ himself a liar, for he himself quoted the Psalms and applied them exclusively to himself.